We're good.
All righty. So welcome, everybody. So the topic for today's conversation really is around cultural change. Kind of had to go at me for the title, saying it doesn't actually represent the conversation topic for today. That's my fault. So I was trying to make it a bit more sexy, because I think, to be honest, if someone said to me cultural change, or even really the word culture, my initial inclination is, well, this is going to be fluffy. It's going to be sort of lacking empirical evidence. It's going to be made up. Fine, culture is important, but it doesn't have all those other qualities that I would typically look for. So I don't reckon I probably would attend if a cultural session came up. Yeah. However, what attracted me to this topic was my conversation with Connor the other day, in which you mentioned a couple of things, Connor, that really piqued my interest. One was that one of the themes from your research was around, if you want to change behavior, you need to change the context. Context will help change behavior. And that, to me, resonated very well, because a lot of the stuff that I the psychology I talk about is about how people's behavior is much more influenced by context than they imagine. So I was particularly interested in that. And the other thing was, you're talking about the connection between, do we follow a process, do we follow guidelines, versus do we use our own sort of subjective senses of creativity or judgment? And there's quite a lot of issues in that interface there. So for those two reasons, I was thinking, actually, this could be quite interesting. So thank you for agreeing to join me in this conversation, Connor. We'll look forward to get into those sort of topics. But perhaps before we kick off, for those of you who haven't met Connor before, do you mind just giving us a little bit of background, perhaps leading up to your PhD, and then we'll jump into the PhD in a sec?
So I've made a career really in the project program and PMO space over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And one of the things that I noticed was the thing that I really didn't understand well enough was people's behavior around projects and programs. I mean, as a kind of project manager, you're kind of encouraged to view people as those kind of unpredictable variables that don't really do what they're supposed to do on time or to the right quality, and that whose engagement you kind of have to force compliance on. And what really got me going was I was running an integration program. I was program director for integration of 12 businesses into one. And I put together a program, having been down there for a couple of months, to the exec team, and I thought I had it pretty well nailed down. I was getting some good comments from the execs, and had one-on-ones. But the CEO dismissed it out of hand, and it had a payback of 18 months. It was all hockey stick from there on in, and I'd kicked some good goals in the meantime. And I went away just thinking, why did that steer call? Why did that exec make that decision? Why did they do that? On the face of it, with a rational business case. I'd been to the CFO, he'd signed off the business plan, people had tested the numbers, and I thought any rational CEO would have gone for this. And I think the kind of clue was in the answer, which was, people don't behave rationally. And that encouraged me to take up to study. I started doing a PhD at Melbourne, and that was sociology. I didn't like what I was seeing in sociology, so I wrapped it up as a master's, and then went on to Monash, to BehaviorWorks, to do a PhD in behavioral science. So that's kind of where I am now.
Fantastic. And so the PhD you've been at now for 3 years, or fair way?
Oh no, way longer than that. I'm doing it part-time. It's don't mention it to my wife. Everybody's sick of me talking about it. I started, I don't even probably want to know, probably about 6 years ago, part-time.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. And I've been doing it nights and weekends, and between breaks and contracting gigs, I've sort of got into it. But the plan is to get it done for Christmas.
Awesome. All right. So you're quite far through, and I know that you've obviously covered a lot of ground in that, but we're today going to focus on one piece of it, which was a study that you've told me about the other day, where you looked at an large-scale engineering business. Yeah. Can you give us a sense of what the firm was and what your hypothesis you were looking at?
Yeah. So look, I'm happy to go wherever the conversation takes us, but we can start off here, because I've covered a fair bit of ground. So what happened was you had a business problem. An engineering-based business needed to increase its product output sixfold. So the capex budget went from, let's say, 100 million to 600 million overnight. And there was a new CEO and management team, and they rightly picked up culture as being a barrier. In other words, it was very bureaucratic. It was very traditional. It was very slow moving, and there was no way that we're going to be able to ramp up and spend 600 million the next year, because they struggled to spend 100 million in the previous years. And there was a very hierarchical. It was a very traditional approach to running the business, and engineering standards, which had been proven over decades, were sacrosanct. They were standards that they just couldn't deviate from. So they figured they rightly identified culture as being a barrier to performance, and that's kind of what I like to see. What worries me about culture change generally is where it's ideologically driven, and isn't tied to a business problem. Be it race or gender or whatever. I think the interesting thing is to nail it down to a business problem, because that's where you get the payoff.
Yeah, so in this case, so that business problem, I know that there's some sensitivity around making sure we don't identify the organisation involved, but yeah. Is it possible to give us a bit of a sense, going from 100 million to 600 million, what was going on to cause that sort of big step change?
There was a strategic crisis. If I get into what the crisis is, you'll figure out who it is. But there was an external crisis that they needed to respond to. Everybody knew that they just needed to ramp up their spend. They'd underinvested chronically in their infrastructure over years, and they just needed to. All of a sudden, that was exposed, and they needed to do something about it.
Okay, so from a rational perspective, like there was no doubt about the need for this thing. You had the burning platform, if you like, exactly. For example. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So the burning platform for change, and then what they did was the challenging thing is to figure out, so what is it about the culture that's getting in the way, and then what are the levers that you need to pull to get that culture change. I mean, there's an approach that's pretty common, which is, you send out a survey, you develop circumplexes, and you go, oh, you're red or you're green, how do we get you into the blue or whatever, and that then rolls out as a process, and that's a really bad way of doing things, because it's not obvious what needs to change to deliver the cultural change.
Yes. So if we just go back to the business problem for a sec, so we've got this large capex spend. But what's happening? Are people then reluctant to spend the money, or reluctant to approve it, or what's going on in that process? Yeah,
I mean, and that's the nature of the digging down into the problem. So you had a bureaucratic organization. So you had head of engineering who said, look, if you want to get these assets built on time, you should have ordered the materials 6 months ago, because they're specialist materials. And I'm sorry, the timeline is just going to have to change. So that was the use of power as well, which often comes with culture. In effect, what happens was you had your culture war between two opposing cultures. You had a culture that wanted to deliver and innovate, and you had a culture which wanted to keep to a traditional way of doing things. So one of the things that they did was they insisted on the old way of doing things, the old materials, the old suppliers. They insisted on having silos between the teams, so that one team had to sign off the previous team's approval, and all of which makes sense in a long-term business. But if you need to respond quickly, it just was never going to happen.
Yeah, and when you say they, so I'm sensing that there is part of the organisation that is wanting to stick to these historical processes, but then part of the organisation that wants to move separately. Is that the two camps you're talking about here? Yeah,
definitely, and you find that in financial services as well. You find subcultures which dominate. So, for instance, you can find front office which dominates and goes, no, I'm sorry, this is the way we do business, and you kind of, it's up to you to cop it. Middle and back office just have to get on with it, and you'll find people on the advice side, very different culture to people in the front office, and you get it's a bit like a schoolyard. You get pushing and shoving to the point where somebody's the king of the schoolyard, and in this instance, it was the engineering department who threw their weight around and said, "No, our word is law. That's the way you have to do it, and there's just no way we're going to sanction you spending that money within that period of time.
Yeah, and were there different incentives? I can imagine if I'm an engineer and perhaps my incentive is not to build a bridge that's going to collapse, for example, and so I want to be really risk conscious in that context versus someone who might have a more commercial or customer centric type set of incentives around their job. Was that the case, do you think?
So it wasn't so much incentives as it was it largely some of it had to do with identity and personality. I mean, in an engineering context, most new ideas are dangerous and bad. You just don't want to do it because, as you say, the standards for building bridges are pretty well set, and materials are tested, and they have all sorts of standards. And something bright, new, and innovative is just like, no, you should be suspicious. So there's been something about engineers' identity makes them highly, in a sense, rational and superstitious. Sorry, suspicious. But also personality. You have people who are low in openness, the trait openness. Those sorts of people very resistant to new ideas unless it's forced upon them.
Yeah. Did you do some personality profiling as part of your study?
I didn't do formal personality profiling. I didn't get them to undergo tests, but a reasonable. I don't think I'll be far off the mark with some of the leaders' behaviour.
Sure, and the identity aspect you noticed there as well. I mean,
So, for instance, there was another instance where a particular engineer said that he thought that the efficiency of a plant would be, in theory, should be 98%. He'd done all the calculations. That was part of his identity as an engineer. But the problem was that was going to delay getting to 98%. Was going to delay construction by a couple of months. Whereas what the business wanted was to get it up to roughly 95% and then leave it. And that involved two different designs. But the guy who held out, the engineer, that was just part of his. He was an engineer, and it was part of his identity that you wanted why wouldn't you have the most efficient process you could have, because that's all his training had given him to believe. And he held out, and he ended up compromising. Actually, ended up on 96% or something. So I think identity is an issue for clearly for people's behaviour and personality.
Sure.
But also to get back to context, you had a department which had ruled the roost and had effectively divided and conquered the different. People didn't work together very well in groups. There were silos. So on that basis, this one department was able to predominate. So one of the things that the management did was they broke down the silos, and they literally co-located people. They took them out of their offices, and they put together project teams around particular projects. So you would have somebody from engineering, you'd have somebody from construction, you'd have somebody from procurement, somebody from finance, and a project manager, and they would sit in a group, so that the old structure of formal meeting rooms and memos just was broken down. So it's a physical structure change led to behaviour change.
So when you say physical structure, so you're saying the physical layout of the office where people are sitting in the teams.
Yeah.
That.
I mean, Edgar Schein's work on culture talks about the pyramid and three layers, but one of and there's at the top there's a layer which is visible, and the physical layout of an office is absolutely cultural. Some of those symbols around. Well, does the exec have an EA outside the door guarding his access to him? Does he have a private meeting room? How big is his office and her office? All that stuff is absolutely crucial. Our behavior our behavior is influenced by context, and some of the stuff we're just not conscious of, but it's definitely there.
Yeah. And what you also mentioned in your description there as well was perhaps what sounds like some of the artifacts, like memos or guidelines or those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. So engineering standards is definitely is an artifact that influences behavior. Policies and procedures absolutely influence behavior. And if you want to get behavior change, you need to not just change policies and procedures, but you need to change a lot of the things that are around them and the basis on which people use them. mean, I think one of the issues, so if you look at, say, risk management, for instance, and risk culture, for instance, I think the first wave has focused on policies, procedure, and to an extent structure. But the thing that I think is less well explored, and it's for others to comment, I suppose, but the ethical decision making of the people at the top, in terms of and their behavior and using those structures. But what you had here in this engineering business was a CEO laser focused on getting culture change and getting the stuff delivered on time.
Yeah, okay. But did you get down to, like, for example, were you looking at changing specific guidelines or changing a specific memo format, or those sorts of perhaps the micro sort of environmental cues that you might be able to change? Is that
actually it changed? Well, it was even more fundamental than that, in that they disregarded a lot of the existing engineering. Well, they disregarded the solutions, traditional. They still had to abide by standards. Like the assets had to meet outcomes. So the standards remained the same, but how they got there was completely open for interpretation and free for all, whereas it hadn't been before. It was engineering saying this is how you must build it, as opposed to the construction people saying no, we can still meet those standards, but in an innovative way.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe taking the standards up a level. So rather than them being specific, you must do A, you must do B, you must do C.
That's
you
true.
can say what's the principle behind it, and then find whatever way you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think what engineering had been used to doing before was specifying the inputs, whereas now they're just going, don't tell us how to do it. We'll still agree to those outcomes because safety and reliability and all those sort of metrics are still important. but let us innovate in terms of how we would get that done.
Yeah. So there's a question from Jane. Working virtually, how does this change your thinking on breaking down the silos and co-locating? Were they working virtually? When did you do this study?
This was pre-pandemic, and they had been in the office. So I think it would be easier in an environment where people worked virtually, because the physical constraints around behavior, or physical cues around behavior, wouldn't be there. So I think it potentially would be easier in this environment to get behavior to change.
There's some upside from the pandemic after all.
Well, I think new ways of working is an interesting topic at the moment, but it depends on the extent to which we return to the pre-pandemic environment. I mean, culture is what helps the internal part of the business deal with the external. Now, we had a shift in terms of what happened to the external environment, so culture has had to change. We're working more remotely, but when the pandemic hopefully changes soon and we're all allowed to physically go back, I'm not sure the extent to which, I just don't know the extent to which virtual working will predominate anymore. I think Theo had a question. Had you, Theo? What was it?
So in an engineering business, does how they get to the outcome matter? It may look like they met the standards but didn't.
So it's an interesting question, Theo. So one of they needed to build an asset that a storage tank, which to their standards would have lasted at least 50 years, and it needed to use rolled steel. And there was no way they were going to get that built in time because that grade of steel wasn't available in Australia. It had to be imported overseas, yada yada. The whole project, and this would have a knock-on effect in the program. What they did was they actually built it from reinforced concrete, so rebar and concrete. Now it delivered the same outcomes in terms of what it did. It just didn't last 50 years. It would last 30 years. But they were going 30 years. Like, can we live with that? And the management said, yeah, we can. To get this whole thing done quickly, definitely we can live with a 30-year asset life as opposed to a 50-year asset life. So the outcomes in terms of what the tank didn't change at all. It just had a shorter lifespan.
Yeah, it's interesting. So perhaps slightly related to Theo's question, I'm quite interested in how much specificity there is in a set of rules or guidelines or an algorithm. And bubbling on in my head, or I haven't quite formulated the thought properly, is this thing called algorithm aversion, where people tend to be averse to using mechanical decision-making processes, particularly when they've got their own expertise. They don't like to follow, because it sort of says, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, just follow these steps and do exactly what we tell you, and it will all work out fine. And sure, there's a lot of benefits in having consistency. It reduces noise and all that sort of stuff. But at what point do you get the expert sort of subjective assessments in there? And so for two things. One is, if I completely disengage that person, they might then not be checking and might not be error spotting. Might be no vigilance, for example. So that's one. And then secondly, I guess, is the accuracy of the combined integrated process and human judgment. To optimize that, I probably need to have a bit of input from both, but sort of allowing the best parts of the consistency of the process with the human judgment in there. And maybe allowing a little bit of leeway opens up for that possibility, but it does introduce some risks as well, doesn't it?
Well, there was a good, I'm sure you're across a good paper by Kahneman and Guy Klein about naturalistic decision-making and the conditions under which intuitive decision makes sense versus a more formal approach, one of which would be algorithms. And they managed to agree that basically intuition was good in a context where you had clear feedback and fast feedback. So in other words, if you're a firefighter or a pediatric nurse, so say a firefighter, you direct the hose, you can see the effect of whether you're doing well or badly instantly, and there's instant feedback. If wherever you're stock picking, or even worse, you're trying to predict put in a new policy around, say, traffic. I mean, good luck. The signals are, you've no idea what the cues coming back from your decision can take years to unravel, and it's not even clear that it's down to your action. I was lucky enough to sit in a room with some senior ex-politicians and ex-bureaucrats who were looking at decision-making around new transport pricing. In other words, the way they have in London, where you've got a CBD charge and other capitals as well. And it's you get charged on time and distance as opposed to like just a general tax on everybody. And the strangest thing I saw was that the politicians used heuristics or rules of thumb. That they didn't look at there was the telephone directory briefing document, which was fabulously done by government bodies. Politicians didn't look at it at all. They just used gut feel. Now there's there are places for gut feel and not, and the context matters.
Yeah.
So I saw senior politicians using gut feel to discuss to look at a really complicated subject like do we change the pricing on the way we price road usage?
Yeah, but going back to your engineering example, so as opposed to the Kahneman and Klein paper, which when I read it, it was more about, well, here are the circumstances as you described. Here are the circumstances in which gut feel works. Here are the circumstances in which actually expertise can be developed by a human. And fine, but it's sort of binary. It's one or the other. Versus actually that point of integration. And there was a paper that tickled my fancy where they had an algorithm, and it was a relatively simple, straightforward algorithm that we know in many cases actually does better than human judgment. And they gave that to someone who had expertise and said, well, you can use this if you wish. And what happened, of course, was that people tended to override that algorithm with their own judgment, and it tended to be worse than if they'd just gone with the algorithm. Anyway, which we've seen hundreds of studies say that in many cases. However, the interesting thing about that particular study was they said, all right, well, what can we do if this is human behavior, that we give them rules and guidelines and they just disregard them and do their own thing and follow their gut instinct or whatever? How can we get them closer to this doing the algorithm, following the guidelines thing? And what they discovered is if you gave people a little bit of leeway to sort of say, well, the guideline says X, but you can go X plus 5 or X minus 5 if you want, or you can tweak these 3 considerations out of these 20, those little things. And what happened was that even though those tweaks actually made the algorithm worse, they would have been better making no tweaks. However, by giving people the opportunity to make those little tweaks, they were more likely to then go with the algorithm. So there was a benefit overall in going slightly worse than the algorithm, but by capturing the piece of engagement. So I do wonder whether yours, thinking about your the guidelines and then allowing some more discretion in there, means that people are then more likely to use the guidelines. If that's, perhaps, do you agree? Does that make sense to you or not?
So they stuck to the guidelines in terms of the outcomes that were expected of the assets. So there was no negotiation around, it's got to be safe, it's got to perform to a certain level. There was a lot more engagement they had because they were able to do their own design basically and not have engineering specify it. I think the issue is that I think algorithms work well in certain defined situations, and we know those what that looks like. But there's a whole raft of situations where algorithms, checklists, and procedures just don't work or are outperformed by heuristics. I mean, I was reminded of the Sully Sullenberger, the guy who landed the plane on the Hudson. He used a heuristic to land a plane. Now, I can think of fewer places richer in data than the cockpit of a modern aircraft. It's just like you've got literally everything at your fingertips. And not only that, the people are well trained, they've got procedures for absolutely every contingency. And he was a super experienced pilot, and he used a heuristic to land it, because what he did. Hey,
what was the heuristic? If in danger, land on a river.
No, it's called the gaze heuristic. So it's similar to how you catch a ball. If it's flying over the top of your head. So what he did was his co-pilot beside him was diligently going through the checklist for what to do in such situations. And Sully realized there wasn't enough time to get through that checklist, because by the time they found the answer, he would have crashed into something. He'd taken off from Newark, I think it was. Just so people don't know the case, and there was a bird strike, and I think all of his engines were one of them, and then the second engine was destroyed. So he was cruising, but he needed to know whether he could see another airport off the right hand side, which is LaGuardia. So he didn't know whether he could circle back and get back down to New York, or whether he would make it across LaGuardia. Without any power at all, he realized he wasn't going to get back to New York. But when he looked at LaGuardia Airport, he could see the control tower of LaGuardia Airport in one of the window frames in the cockpit. And what his heuristic was, if that control tower was rising in the window pane or flat, he was going to be able to make it, because the plane was climbing. When he looked at the control tower, beg your pardon, if it was falling, he was going to make it. What he saw was the control tower was rising within the window pane. He could control on hands on the stick. He realized in an instant, we're not going to make it to LaGuardia. He didn't look at any of the instruments. He didn't go through any checklists, and I'll send you a link of the chat between the tower and him. It's just amazing. He just said, "No, we're going the river," and it's just instant. And heuristics are fantastic in those sort of situations. He didn't use any data at all. It was just what's called the gaze heuristic, which is he looked out the window, he saw that the tower was rising in that window, and he decided to ditch the plane.
Yeah, so perhaps that's a good segue to say, well, what are some of the broader conclusions from this research then? Sorry, I'm just seeing there's an analysis paralysis, and how do you come back? All right, why don't we tackle that one first, then I'll come back to my question. What's your response to that, to Theo's?
Yeah, it's hard to know without knowing the context, but it sounds like that's an environment where making a mistake is heavily punished. So there's some big disincentives for getting stuff wrong, and in many situations, elaborate thinking is the right way to go. because you can get things wrong. Most new ideas are bad, and generally quick action is riskier than doing things more slowly. I think it depends on the context. If you have a and the business problem, if there's some business downsides from overanalyzing, I think it's worth exposing what they are and looking at a different way of solving it. Is there a specific you have in mind, Theo? That
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's a great example because it's life or death. But
yeah,
a lot of people will go to, I need more data, I need more data, I need more data before they make a decision.
Yeah.
As the decision gets more and more important, there is a tendency to ask for more and more information to make that decision.
Yeah.
Right? So whether it's a life or death thing, the example you just provided, or whether it's a project and we're going to invest $20 million to build or whatever, or anything, how do you set up a framework to get people to say, okay, we've analysed it to a certain degree, we can keep asking for more and more and more, but then you've got like kind of the diminishing marginal returns kicking in, right?
Yeah.
How do you set up frameworks to combat that? I don't think you can prevent it, but you can just try and, combat it.
Yeah. Well, the theory would say that people aren't, they just haven't found the answer that they're looking for in the analysis. It's not that they need more analysis; they just need potentially different analysis. So if you accept that people use heuristics or mental shortcuts to make decisions, there's an interesting article you'll be across it, by Jonathan Haidt, which is the emotional dog and its rational tail. People make decisions that largely aren't rational and looking for justification in the data as opposed to real numbers. So it sounds like you've got a bunch of people who haven't found the right answer, and they're just looking for more analysis to get them to the point where they go, I knew that all along. That's you've finally done proper analysis, whereas all you've done is matched up with the heuristic that they had in the back of their head anyway.
I actually one of the topics that I run is about dealing with information overload and noise, and this is one of the questions that comes up, and it's actually interesting what you say, because some of the things resonate with and quite closely connect with that. I mean, what I'm looking at, I guess, in that is to say, well, as Theo's pointed out, you get these rapidly diminishing marginal returns past the first, second, third biggest points. Which is not to say, do I need to look at point 10 and point 11 and point 12, because frankly, until I've done enough work, I don't know whether that thing that I'm going to find actually is the most important thing. So I have to, but once I've identified what the most important things are, to go looking at point 17, 18, 19, 20, probably it's going to, you can end up with a dilution effect of those things actually then dilute the impact of the biggest things. And you get that tapering of decision-making accuracy, which I think is what you're referring to there, because it's just my confirmation bias now. It's I've got the answer. It's not the answer I wanted. Let's keep looking for more things.
Exactly.
I get the answer that I wanted.
I think that's what it is. Ultimately, though, you would need different decision makers, because structure influences everything. If you have a different bunch of people around the table, you'll get different answers. It's not around. You can say, we'll put, we'll limit the number of iterations on this sort of analysis, but you'll always find somebody who says, that's option 2, but can we have option 2A? And we're still looking at 2 options, right? And can we have option 2B? I mean, people will find a way around that. You still end up doing like 80 iterations of the same bloody analysis. And it's that there's something in the environment which says that either I've largely got the power and you haven't given me the answer that I want, or else there's some fairly severe sanctions around being seen to not act the way the boss would expect you to act, or to, in some ways, to get it wrong.
Yeah, and also when you put people in studies and give them more and more information, so what does giving them more information do? Well, you end up with a fairly linear relationship with their confidence. The more information they have, the more confidence they get. So you can understand that if I get more confident, my boss gets more confident, the board gets more confident, we're all getting more confident. but decision-making accuracy doesn't continue up at that same trajectory. It sort of tapers right off.
Yeah.
So we're just basically investing in confidence, but not necessarily in accuracy as we get into that sort of all those marginal pieces and do more and more and more analysis.
Yeah, well, as I say, I saw some very senior people make some very big calls based on very little information. It's with the right people around the room, you don't have to do a huge amount of analysis. As I say, this I think it'll eventually go their way, but this was around pricing traffic car use in Melbourne. And some politicians made some very, on the basis of a couple of hour discussion, without having read the detailed modelling. There was endless amounts of modelling and business case scenarios, and they didn't refer to it at all. And they were quite happy to make a decision.
Yeah, fair enough. So hopefully that's
just out of curiosity. Sorry, Simon. How far away were they from what was recommended by the experts?
Like 180 degrees. So there were there was a particular, and I think I think we need to be a bit careful too. There was the bureaucrats were a little bit upset with the politicians because they were going, oh, we've done all this fantastic work. They haven't looked at it. They're just shooting from the hip. They should be taking a more rationalist approach to decision making. And actually, what was really happening was that the politicians, the bureaucrats, had fallen in love with the detail of their proposal, and the rational people in the room were actually the politicians, because they were detached, and they were going, yeah, I'm not convinced. So the politicians were. Dan Andrews cut the whole thing down in a sentence, and he's basically saying we're not asking people to pay for roads that they've already paid for, and that's a heuristic. That is like, we're just not going to do that. So regardless of the volumes of data that have been crunched, they just went, no, we're not doing it. And in fact, the interesting thing was, without revealing names, there was a right-wing ex-senior politician there. His view was the issue was not pricing traffic, but immigration, because he said we need to have stricter controls over migration, because when you get population growth, you therefore get traffic growth, and that will lead to congestion. So I think the answer is migration. So again, nothing to do with the analysis or engaging with the brief that they've been given.
Interesting. Okay, well, I was going to tell, I wanted to be conscious to leave a bit of time for any more questions that come through, but I was interested to see what further connections you can draw from the research that you did, or the work you did with that engineering organisation, and then more broadly. So we've already looked at one, which is potentially the use through designing virtual or back to the office type scenarios. But what else do you draw from that engineering study that you can see applications for changing behaviour, changing culture more generally?
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in leadership decision making now, because one of the things I saw during that case study was that the engineers, the project managers, really didn't have much of a chance in terms of resisting the way that the top team wanted to go. I explored with them in over hours of interviews what went through their mind as they were faced with a change towards different working arrangements, different ways of building things, how the job would be impacted. And basically they didn't have an awful lot of those people who resisted got ground out, because what happened was there are a bunch of people, and I've had a look at their profile. I've done the personality profile of since people who comply straight away. So you'll get a bunch in any culture change, that you'll get a bunch of people who get on board straight away, and there's debate in the theory, but basically people who are agreeable and conscientious will, the Milgram experiment, giving electric shots, that was agreeableness and conscientiousness. You'll also find people who are low in openness will kind of just follow authority, because like they delegate effectively the environment search to people in authority. So you'll get a bunch of people straight away who'll just get on board and go, yeah, I'm doing that. What happens is because of senior management and the people who are already on board, you'll get quite a bit of pressure on the people who are holding out. And that is, for want of a better expression, emotional work. People start to lose sleep, they become stressed, and the burden of pushing back finally it gets too much for them to bear, and they either compromise or comply, or else they leave. But basically, large-scale culture change, as I saw there, is a pretty brutal and Darwinian affair. You know, it really grinds down on people pretty hard, and you know, people have got to get on with it. So in that context, I really then became, I should have been more interested in people's plight around being forced to do things by corporations, because we've all been there. But I was really interested in decision making on behalf of the people at the top, leadership decision making, and the extent to which that is ethical or not. I think ethical decision making is an unexplored area, and I think those ethics. I think what happens in ethical decision making is you get a clash of two heuristics. You know, you get two rules of thumb which clash. So and often the sort of social pressure is the one that prevails.
So the two rules of thumb are what I think is the right thing to do versus what I think is the commercial thing to do, or the social.
Well, yeah. Let me take an extreme example. There was a study done on German police during World War II, or afterwards in World War II. These were middle-aged coppers who were just literally conscripted into the army, and they had to, and they were, you know, ordinary people, and they ended up in firing squads, killing prisoners of war and Jews. So it's a pretty horrific situation, and most of them suffered horribly as a result. I mean, psychologically suffered horribly as a result. Now they weren't amoral people by any means, you know, but they had two heuristics running at the same time. One is like, thou shalt not kill, basically. So that was and for coppers, you know, that was, despite what you might think, that was important. But the other one was don't break ranks, which is I'm part of this group and I'm part of this machine, and everybody else around me seems to be doing this. So there's social pressure on them to conform. It led to them doing, you know, horrible things. And I think, and I'm not, that's an extreme example, but I think to a lesser extent, you find that in boardrooms, you find a kind of social pressure to behave one way, and yet their inner compass is saying, I don't think this is right. But social pressure can push people, and that social pressure some of it can be motivated by incentive. But kind of ethical decision making at the top, I think, is where the leverage is to be applied. Not so much through the rank and file, because once the machine gears up, I think it's very difficult for individuals to push back.
Yeah, I've got a question coming through from Jane, which we'll get to in a second. I just want to pick up one point that I think connects with what you just described there, which was the ASH experiments that you might be aware of from, I don't know, back in the 60s or something, where they got people around a table, they had to measure, they had to assess the length of lines. Have you seen this study?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for those of you who haven't come across it before, there might be 9 people would all get the question wrong, and they're all stooges who have been brought in the experiment to deliberately get it wrong. And then the real person is the 10th person. And how do they respond? Do they respond by following everybody else in the crowd, or do they go with what their eyes are showing them, which is that actually all those people were wrong and maybe they should say something different? And what that experiment showed was that not in all cases and not everyone, but for most people, some of the time, they're influenced by that group. But interestingly, they were influenced more than they thought, and not necessarily deliberately. Mm-hmm. So the social impact had impacted their decisions often beyond their awareness. They're following the crowd, even though, oh no, I actually thought A was the right answer. Yeah, sure you did. All right. Yeah, but they're not saying that. They're not deliberately lying. That they genuinely thought, oh no, really, maybe. Oh yeah, possibly A's right. No, not A.
Well, I mean, that's what I saw in this case study too. Is that people often weren't aware that context was influencing their behavior. Yeah. They just weren't aware of it. Yeah. Because it operates on habits we've got. It operates on subconscious, and it operates on sort of a web of heuristics we've got in our head. They're just not aware of it. Which is why it's most powerful, because if you change structure, you can change people's behavior without them realizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree completely. Should we turn to Jane's question? Do you have any suggestions for merging super funds and their quest to develop the culture of a new company? How to best manage the transition or merge companies in general?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jane. So I think so in culture change, I like to look at the business problem. It's best if you tie it to what's the problem we have here? You need a burning platform for change. To an integration in itself, if they're in the same industry with same sort of culture, then you'd have to work hard to figure out what's the risk. I would imagine that in an integration. So you're familiar with Price's law, or if you're not, Simon. So Price's law says that half the output is delivered by the square root of the number of people, and there's a fair bit of data to support that. So in a 1,000-person organization, this would say something like 33 people are doing half the work. I think it, and we've all thought we all think we're proud of those 33, right? We all look around and go, yeah, I can fully accept that. But there is some evidence to support that. I think in integrating to businesses, you want to identify the 33, make sure you got them locked in, because they're the people who will leave, because they're the really good people who work their arses off and who've got a lot of skill. The other 900 and whatever it is, 967, you could probably care less about. I don't mean not at all, but I think they're the people who you kind of potentially don't need to worry as much about.
Well, maybe we can throw this one back to Jane, if you're there, Jane. What issue or what business critical issue are you seeing that you think the merging has to be conscious of or to manage correctly?
To me, it's maintaining innovation of the funds. So as you merge, there's a lot of resources that will look at, the merged entity and how we transition to that. I guess to me, that innovation bit, how do you maintain that during a period of integration?
Yeah, it's probably that's probably going to be too complex, I would imagine. I would have thought an alternative approach is to how can you integrate as quickly as possible so you get back to business as usual and innovate. I think innovating during a transition, I think you've got to look at the organization's capacity to absorb all of that. I think you'd have existing innovations in place, and it takes a long time for innovation to come through in financial services. So you let your existing innovations run through and get the integration done as quickly as possible, so that you can get back to business as usual. But the innovations come from innovative people, and I'm tipping that they'll be part of those 33. So if you can hang on to the innovative people, that'll be a good first step, I think.
Yeah, there's a study that I can't remember when I read it, so I'm probably going to not get it completely right. But as I recall it, what they did is they took key decision makers, CEOs, and sort of high-level execs, and they measured some aspects of their decision making. I think it was around to what extent were they more innovative versus were they more sort of standard and more procedural, that sort of thing. And they had a bunch of measures of the stress of the senior executives were under. So they were subjective assessments in their own survey responses, but I'm pretty sure they also asked the spouse, often wives, but possibly husbands or partners or whatever, how stressed they thought the senior executive was in their home environment with the kids or whatever. Anyway, so they had all these measures of stress, and then they had all these measures of the level of innovation and creativity and willing to take risks and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so you end up with this sort of inverse relationship, that the level of stress that these people were under then tended to be associated with a lower level of creativity, which would suggest, and that, I mean, that's more broadly, I guess you see that with creativity. You don't get a lot of you don't get creative thinking anyway by saying, right, you've got to be creative and you've got to do it in the next 3 minutes, right? You've got to allow, stress tends to be an antithesis of sort of at least the thinking. It can be, obviously can spur action, but in terms of the thinking. So that would, to me, suggest or add weight to your suggestion that let's get the integration done. Yeah, because that would reduce the burden of stress of everyone in the organization, that then would allow them to open up for that piece of sort of more creative bit of thinking. Yeah,
I think, I agree, Simon. I think, Jane, one of the things that causes us stress is the extent to which we can ignore stuff. there's so many cues available to us in our normal life that you have to ignore most of it. And that's why routine policies and procedures really help, because you've pre-made those decisions. In an integration of two corporations, you'll have, at least for a period of time, a point at which, how much of this can I ignore? How much is different? And that will cause, that in itself will cause stress. The kind of the complexity around, well, and I think that's been part of the problem. One of the problems with COVID is that things that we took for granted are no longer can be taken for granted, and that causes us stress, because we go, well, hang on, what else could possibly change? It just makes the taking for granted, which is really important for us, it throws that up in the air. And I think that's also likely to be a case in an integration where you've got, two bunches of people who don't quite know what's real anymore. I mean, in a sense, if you're part of an organization and you've bought into the vision and the culture, and now it's changed. Well, hang on, was that all just bullshit in the past? Does like, not only does it change the future, it changes the past as well. It changes your vision of what you're doing now, what you thought you were doing before, and what you'd like to do in the future. So it's hugely stressful, which is why I think getting it done quickly and in a program like way is will help people.
What have you witnessed, Jane? Do you think innovation is dropping off?
No, not necessarily at all. It was just, I guess, something to be conscious of, I think, because there's a lot of changes that are happening in the industry that, super funds will need to be on the front foot about. So it's just making sure that things are evolving. I think there's small steps that you can take in these sort of times to keep innovation, or keep your mind thinking broader, to bring in those innovative thoughts.
Like what sort of things do you have in mind?
Oh, just like today, participating in a discussion that is quite different to, regular discussions, just opens your mind to different ideas and possibilities. So, it's something that you're still gathering thoughts on and gathering ideas about. And so that, you've got that knowledge base when you come to, after the integration's occurred, sort of thing,
Yeah.
Or that you could put in place along the way that are more BAU sort of things. So, you can tweak or optimize what you're currently doing.
Yeah. And kind of for information, Jane's in Queensland, so she hasn't had to worry about COVID. There's no problem there at all.
Good for you.
Until the borders open up.
Yeah. Can we bring it into you?
Fantastic. All right. Well, we're almost out of time. So perhaps kind of any sort of final words of sort of big ticket conclusions you've drawn from this research, something you think we should follow up?
Yeah, that's. I think that's setting me up a little bit too much.
All right. Apologies.
Oh, look, change structure is the big thing for me, and most of us can't push back against those structures. So I think ethical decision making is where it's at.
Yeah. Okay. And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, I'm on LinkedIn, probably the simplest.
Okay, no, that sounds good. We're all on LinkedIn now. This is a LinkedIn event, so that sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, we can't see anything else in the chat, so I will thank Theo and Jane for participating, and Connor for your time as well.
Thanks, Simon.
And we'll close it off, and this will be available as a podcast for anybody else. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you both very much.
Thanks a lot.
See you later.
Thanks, everyone.